So we're all underway. So yeah, welcome everyone to our latest free online talk from Great Wall Group, part of our ongoing monthly series of talks, mostly given by members of the group, but also others as well, areas of interest to them. We've had a really diverse range of topics over the months. And tonight we're really delighted to welcome Chris Loader to talk to us about Secrets of Salonika, which I think is going to be a really, really fascinating talk on a subject that probably doesn't get the attention that it deserves. So just as a quick way of introduction, Chris may be known to some of you as Great Wall Group member. And he works in his professional life involved in the exciting world of horse racing, and in fact has recently changed jobs and is currently working for the Racecourse Association here in the UK. But with his first-world law interests, as I say, he's a Great Wall Group member. He's also secretary of the Salonika Campaign Society, of course ties in with tonight's topic, and he also hosts a podcast, Salonika Secrets, which has been running since earlier on this year, set off in April. So that's certainly something to listen into as well, and perhaps Chris will tell us a little bit more about the podcast as well. But for now, I will stop talking and I will hand over to you, Chris.
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to telling you all about the Salonika campaign tonight. So the way my talk's going to look for the next hour or so, it's going to be kind of split into three parts. So the first part, we're just going to go into how the war started out there, how the Salonika campaign developed, and then I'm going to tell you about my own personal connection to the campaign. And then lastly, for the last third of the talk, we're going to talk about my battlefield trip out there last year with the Salonika Campaign Society. So it's kind of hopefully going to all roll into one, and hopefully answers a lot of the questions you may have around Salonika. But if you have anything at the end, yeah, feel free to ask. So if we were actually in a room tonight and we weren't in the world of Zoom, I would actually ask you to raise your hand and see if you've heard of the Salonika campaign. As you are the Great Wall Group, I would have assumed some of you have probably heard of the campaign, but for the vast majority of people, they probably haven't come across it before, or if they have heard of it, they know very little about it. In my opinion, it is truly the forgotten front of all forgotten fronts. I know people might say, well, Mesopotamia was, maybe the front in East Africa was. That's fair enough, but I do think, from at least a British perspective, the fact that at its height they had over 220,000 men stationed out there in the British Salonika force, I think it truly is a forgotten area in the First World War when it comes to Britain's part in it. So yeah, that's something we're definitely going to be addressing in the talk tonight. So to kind of understand the Salonika campaign, you kind of got to get your head around the politics of the region. It's very complicated. I'm not going to go into a real in-depth study here because we could be here all night on this particular subject, but I'll try and give you a flavour of how it all started and who the key players were. So this is a map of Europe during the First World War, and as you can see down here, it's got Greece as an allied nation, Serbia as an allied nation, Romania as an allied nation, and Bulgaria as one of the central powers. So how did that all play out? Why did they choose to take the side of the Allies and some take the side of the central powers? It's really one that takes a while to get your head around, but largely the key to it is the years in the run-up towards the First World War, especially with the Balkan Wars. I should explain that a lot of this area here, I don't know if you can see my cursor at all that's moving. So if you can see over here on the map for the Balkans in 1908, sorry, this is how the lay of the land essentially looked. A lot of this area in the previous centuries had been under the influence of the Ottoman Empire, and in 1912, a lot of the countries that had been under their occupation or under their influence decided to rise up and basically unite to throw them out once and for all, and they did. In there, you had the likes of Greece, you had the likes of Bulgaria, the likes of Serbia, and Bulgaria, and then basically after the war ended out there, this is kind of what the lay of the land looked like. You can see there that Greece was a big winner, Serbia was a big winner, but Bulgaria wasn't necessarily happy with what they got out of it. They didn't get the greatest amount of land, and they were always a little bit peeved off. So what happened shortly afterwards? They decided to go to war against the allies that they'd just been fighting with. So in 1913, they decided to rise up, and they drove it down into this area, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, because this is the area really that's always been in contention. This area, which is known as Macedonia. The Serbs had claims to it, the Greeks had claims to it, but the Bulgarians too felt like they had claims to it. So they tried to get more territory, but it's quickly quashed. And they even had help, the Greeks and the Serbs, who tried to prevent the Bulgarians from the Ottoman Empire. So it really it didn't end well for Bulgaria. So this is essentially what the lay of the land looked like at the start of the First World War. Now, coming back to my point about, it's funny that not really too many people know anything about the Salonika campaign. This is the neck of the woods, really, where the First World War started, with the assassination in Sarajevo in June 1914 by a Serbian, the nationalist group, the Black Hands. It's just surprising that after this, the war's just escalated, and this region, from at least a Western perspective, is just really kind of forgotten about. For the first couple of years, for around about the first year of the war, Serbia has been involved in conflict with the Austro-Hungarians, but has been able to frustrate them, and the Austro-Hungarians haven't really been able to break through and knock Serbia out of the war. And this is kind of what the lay of the land looked like. In 1915, you have to say that the Central Powers definitely have the upper hand in the First World War in Europe. Germany's had very good success, beating the Austrians earlier on at the Battle of Tannenberg. The Austro-Hungarians have been having some success. And also, as well, the Allies are being ground down at Gallipoli down here by the Ottoman Empire. And you can see here that this area shaded is all from Bulgaria, Austro-Hungary, and Ottoman Empire. It's kind of like a little corridor, if you like, of the Central Powers. And one of the main reasons for trying to get Bulgaria in the war, which it should be said, before October 1915, was a neutral country. They hadn't declared allegiance to the Central Powers or the Allies. They, in fact, actually had been having discussions with the Allies to come into the war, because the Allies had been worried, for one reason, about Bulgaria taking the side with the Central Powers, and that was because of the Constantinople Railway, which would have been basically a major transport link from Berlin all the way down to Constantinople, which means they can just ship supplies and help reinforce their Ottoman allies. So it's quite a key area of land, and both sides have kind of been promising to one another that to Bulgaria, the Allies and Central Powers, that basically you can have the lands that you didn't get out of the Balkan War. So that's kind of like their main cause. There are a few underlying causes that I could go into, but it's quite complicated to get your head around with Bulgaria. But what happens is that they decide to throw in their lot with the Central Powers in October 1915. And at this time, the Germans have had a bit of enough with the Austro-Hungarians. I think it's twice that the Austro-Hungarians have tried to knock Serbia out of the war, but for the third attempt, they're going to go and help them with reinforcements, and also, as well, it means that they've got Bulgaria now to go in and help to really knock them out of the war. At this time, Greece is a little bit nervous. Greece is a neutral country. It's declared no allegiance to the Allies or the Central Powers, but the Allies would like it to be on their side. But the big player standing in their way is King Constantine I of Greece. He's actually married to the Kaiser's sister. However, his prime minister, Venezuelos, I can never pronounce his name right. He was actually pro the Allied cause, and because they knew that Serbia was going to get invaded, and they actually had a treaty that they signed before the First World War. Basically, if they were ever attacked by Bulgaria, they would come to one another's aid. But Serbia has got all its eyes fixed on trying to defend its own borders, so they can't. They're not really worrying about Greece, and Greece kind of with its links to the Kaiser through the king, they don't really want to. They don't really want to upset that apple cart, as it were. But Venezuela, who was key in the negotiations, he wants to keep that keep that alliance alive. So he decides to invite two divisions of British troops along with the French to go to Salonika. And Salonika is what we now know as modern day Thessaloniki in Greece. It's actually Greece's second largest city. So the British and the French arrive in the city in October 1915. There was no logic why the troops that they sent to Thessaloniki were sent. They were just the nearest troops available. The British, as I say, they sent two divisions, one of them being the 10th Division that had just been fighting at Gallipoli. So they'd been getting stuck into that, and then they're told that they got to go to Salonika. So they didn't really have any rest in between. I think they only had about a month or so before they're told that they're going. So they go to Thessaloniki, or Salonika as it's known in the First World War, in October 1915. But only a couple of days afterwards, Bulgaria joins the assault on Serbia, and Serbia is invaded by the Austrians, the Germans, and the Bulgarians. And Serbia knows that this time it can't put up a fight, and they marched their entire army across to the Adriatic Sea through what is now Albania, and it's an absolute disaster for them. It's roughly about a quarter of their number of the 400,000 actually make it to Albania, and it's something that should actually be studied in a little bit more depth. I've been lucky enough to actually attend a couple of talks this year with the Salonika Campaign Society. Colonel Nick Illich, he's actually the defence attaché to Serbia. He's given some really good talks on it. So if you see his name going around, definitely make note of that, and he'll tell you about that Serbian evacuation to the Adriatic coast, and eventually they do get shipped by the Royal Navy to Corfu, and then they're sent round again to Salonika and are able to regroup. But that's kind of another story for another time. So as I say, the British and French troops, they're in Salonika in October 1915. Once they know that Serbia's been invaded, they get the all clear to kind of leave the city and push up north to what is now the Greece, North Macedonia border. And once they get there in December 1915, they engage with the Bulgarian troops that have also been on the move, but some of them have been on the move towards what is now Greece, but some of that land that they were fighting in was technically Serbia at the time. So the two forces kind of meet and they fight in the hills at the Battle of Costarino, and it's a terrible disaster for the Allies. When they were fighting, it was very cold in December. A lot of the kit the British soldiers had as well, they literally brought with them from Gallipoli. So they were basically in summer clothing, fighting in winter warfare. And a lot of the battle when they were fighting as well was very foggy. It was very misty. They had very poor conditions, so they couldn't actually see a lot of the enemy. And because the Bulgarians had experience of fighting in this land just before the war, they knew it like the back of their hand, and the Allies really didn't. And it's not a good result. Around about just under 1,000 British casualties in that battle. It doesn't sound too much by some of the standards on the Western Front, but with the amount of troops that were involved, just a few battalions, it's not a good result. So the Allies, the British and the French, are forced to retreat back to Salonika. Whilst this is going on, as I said, the Serbian army had been in retreat, so it's not going well for the Allies at all in this part of the world, and they moved back to the port of Salonika. Whilst that's going on, the British, they they don't want to hang around. They want to jump ship and get out of Salonika, but the Allies have a sit down, and because the French had political and economic links to the region and they didn't want to abandon Serbia, they say, no, we've got to stay. So what happens is they're worried about if Bulgaria decides to advance further. They kind of have consolidated their positions around where they fought the Battle of Costarino. But at the time, the Allies don't know this, and they're worried that that the Bulgarians are going to come down to Thessaloniki, and it's going to be under their sphere of influence. And if it was, then that would have been a perfect U-boat base for the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian Navy to use in the First World War and destroy Allied shipping lanes coming up through the Suez. So it's an option that the Allies can't really afford to take. So they really have to defend the city. So what they do is they build defences outside the city, and it's got machine gun posts, bunkers, bridges, you name it, lots of barbed wire as well. And that's what gives it the nickname the birdcage line, because the soldiers thought they were being caged in by the barbed wire. And this is a picture of some of the British soldiers building some of those trench systems and defences outside the city. And this is what some of the defences look like today. I don't know if you can actually see on this particular one, but this is actually the edge of a bridge, and it was actually built by the Royal Engineers. It actually says 99 Corps, 1916. So prime time for when they were building those birdcage defences. And again, this is another part of the bunker. But if you go out there, this is around about 20 miles out on the outskirts of the city. So the defence system was quite large, but they fortunately never have to use it, and it's never tested, and it's just left to decay and crumble. And that's, like I say, what it looks like today. But whilst that's been going on, the Bulgarians, as I say, they were digging in. They knew this land like the back of their hand, and with the help of their German and Austrian colleagues, they're really able to build some really solid defences, and they get to work. This is actually taken from the photo of the 9th Pleven Division, and I'll talk about these a little bit later. They're actually based at Doiran, where most of the heavy British fighting took place, and they were like Bulgaria's elite units. So this is them in action building their defences. So essentially, once the birdcage line's been built and the Bulgarians have been building their defences, this is what the front line ended up looking like. And essentially, the line that you're going to see is 250 miles long. Once the Allies know that the Bulgarians aren't going to come to Salonika, they push out. And what happens is the French go to the west of the Vardar River, and the British go to the east. And the British line starts really at Doiran, and it goes all the way to over here, which is now kind of on the border of eastern Greece. And I'll go into what the landscape looks like a little bit later, because they're chalk and cheese. But essentially, the British line was around 90 miles long, but the whole line, Allied line, is 250 miles long. So the British do have quite a bit of territory to guard, but they're the junior partner in this, and the French are really the commanders in chief, as it were, and the British have kind of got to be told what they've got to do by Sarai. I think the name of the field marshal is. Don't quote me on that one. They go for a few French commanders out there, but essentially, the British Salonika force are under the French there. So that's kind of a basic overview of how the war started out there. And if you've got any questions on that, we can go into that later, and I'll cover more of some of what goes on out there on my tour section later on. But for now, I'm going to talk to you about my own personal connection to the Salonika campaign. And this is a picture of my great-great-granddad, Henry Albert Obadiah Loader. I think he had a great name. But unfortunately, he wasn't to survive the First World War because he got killed in the Salonika campaign. But growing up, I didn't know too much about this. So I'm just going to give you an overview, really, of a little bit of background to Henry's life. He wasn't a superstar. He didn't have like a great, like, outstanding, extraordinary life. He was just an average Joe. He was born in Egham in Surrey on May the 28th, 1881. He was the son of Obadiah Loder and Jane Mott, and he had 10 siblings, including a twin who had actually gone to die of wounds sustained in the First World War a couple of years after the war. And he's actually buried in a Commonwealth war grave in Staines Cemetery. So yeah, it wasn't a good omen that his twin also as well died as a result of wounds from the First World War. He stayed in Egham with his parents for the first 20 years of his life. He went to the local school, but in 1901, that's where things started to change for him. He met his fiancée, Lottie, and also as well, he got a job in the brewing trade. So he must have liked a pint from looking at his work, or you like to think he might have done anyway, working in the brewing trade. And it was not long until, I say, he met his fiancée Lottie in 1901, and it wasn't long until they got married in 1903. And they got married in Lottie's hometown, which is a small village in Hampshire called Kingsonbourne. But after they got married, they went back to Henry's neck of the woods. Maybe they thought he was going to be a bit homesick or something. Not too sure. But they went and they lived around the Egham area. They lived in Egham for a while. Then they moved to Staines. And then they moved to Mortlake, where my great-grandfather was born. And that's a picture of Henry and his wife. And there's his 4 children. That's his eldest daughter, Gladys. That's my great-grandfather, Leonard. That's his youngest son, Cecil. And then that was his youngest daughter, May. So he would go on to have 4 children. And it was just before the First World War that they moved to Andover in Hampshire. And this is where they are at the outbreak of the First World War. Henry was still working, as far as we know, in the brewing trade, but their world's about to change because in 1914, Lottie, her elder brother, Ernest Dalton, was killed at the Battle of Mons. So the family are scathed with the loss from the First World War very early on. Lottie's brother was a member of the first Royal Scots Fusiliers, and he was actually killed on the 23rd of August 1914. So he's amongst the very first men to be killed on what is to become the Western Front, and he's actually on this memorial. Unfortunately, I've not been able to get out there myself, but his body was missing and it was never found. So yeah, the family have a casualty very early on, and you would think that what he's about to do would put him off from not taking part in the war, but he decides to enlist. Not long after, he enlists at the beginning of 1915, and you would have thought that having a family, having 4 kids, why would you want to risk that all on putting it on the line when you know your brother-in-law had just been killed, a professional soldier? So he just decided to enlist, and I think that was quite a really brave decision. I have been told by some higher authorities that because he was a married man in 1915, he would have had choice of which battalion he wanted to join ahead of single men. So if that is true, but we don't know, I don't exactly know for sure, he joined the 10th Hampshire Battalion, which was a service battalion. And like I said, some of the troops that fought in Salonika had fought at Gallipoli, and the 10th Hampshires were amongst those that fought Gallipoli. But then after Gallipoli, they then go to Salonika, and they're out there in Salonika from the start of the campaign in October 1915 right to the end in September 1918. So Henry goes and joins them. We don't think he was actually posted there until 1916 because he wasn't awarded the 1915 star on his medal index card. So we think he would have gone out there in 1916 because there's another source that says he was actually with the 10th Hampshires for 3.5 years. So when you kind of do the math on that, from when he died in September 1918, he joined in the early part of 1915. So Henry, as I say, would go on to join the 10th Hampshires, and he was actually based in D Company. There's actually a family legend that he was a sniper, but we can't prove that for sure. That's what some of my distant family said. But unfortunately, he would die in the Salonika campaign on the 1st of September 1918. He was fighting at the Battle of Roche Noir, which was a diversionary attack. I'll go into that a little bit later. He was then wounded and treated from that battle at 40th Casualty and Clearing Station. And then he would actually go on a train to Salonika to the 28th General Hospital, where he would actually have his arm amputated, and he lost his right arm. And luckily, we're able to know that because the hospital logbooks still survive, which is incredible. Some of that stuff for Salonika does survive. When you try and research in other theatres of war, that material doesn't exist. So I'm really lucky to actually find that, even though it is a bit gruesome and makes you feel even more sad, really, reading that kind of information. And though he had an operation to remove his arm, it didn't do the trick, and a few days later he died. The family legend is that he died of gangrene, so maybe putting two to two together, he had an infection after his operation, and that's what led to him unfortunately passing away. And he died on the 14th of September 1918. But unfortunately, due to family politics, we weren't able to never know his story. Like I say, he's my direct descent. I've got the same surname of his, but we never knew anything about it. And it was only one day when my auntie said, "Oh yeah, we think that we've got this relative of ours that died in the Boer War." And when I asked her who it was, and she was like, "Well, it's this guy. His name's Henry." And I'm like, "Okay." And I was like, "Well, he couldn't have died in the Boer War because my great grandfather was born in 1909, 7 years after, so we wouldn't be here otherwise." So it took a while to look into it and find out, but eventually I was able to say, look, he died in the First World War. So there was a little bit of an element of truth in it, but as many family legends like there's always an element of truth, but most of it is just added on to just to probably give us a bit more to feed off for our imagination. So that's kind of how I began to find out about his story, but I didn't really know too much where to go because, like I say, our family never had any any letters or medals or personal effects brought back to him. And it was only that when I went one day to the Imperial War Museum, you might have seen that they've done a project over the years called Lives of the First World War, and people can choose to remember people. And apart from myself and my sister, there was someone else that was remembering him, and I was thought, who's this chap? So I looked into him, and he turns out he was actually a cousin of my grandfather. But my grandfather, he never met my grandfather, so that's again interesting that his side of the family kind of knew about it. So I managed to track him down, and he lived in the middle of nowhere in Pembrokeshire. And I rang him up, and he said, "Oh yeah, I know all about it. I've actually been out to Greece and visited his grave, and I've got his medals, and I've got his dog tags, and I've got his engagement ring, his cap badges. I've got the full shebang, as it were." So we were really lucky to find that, and this is what some of the personal effects he had. So we've got Henry's medals here. He got the victory and war medal, which was standard for most British troops. That was the death penny that was sent back to the family after he died. And then these were his cap badges, and that was his wedding ring, supposedly he was wearing when he died. So yeah, it was great to see some of these personal effects, and they're on his side of the family. But if I hadn't done that extra research and visited the Imperial War Museum, I may never been able to find the lead that got me to see these. So it was really good. So that kind of, after meeting Don, really watered my appetite, and I thought, you know what, I got to go out there and visit his grave. But the problem is, even though we'll come to it in a minute, his grave is in the city centre of Salonika, and it's really easy to go and visit. But the problem is, if you want to find out more about him, there's not really that much material out there. Books are limited. I've never seen a documentary on the subject. So I thought I need to try and see if I can go on a battlefield tour. But again, your normal places you go for battlefield tours, like Ledgers and people like that, they don't cover this area. But luckily, these guys do, the Salonika Campaign Society. And this is actually a veterans organisation, essentially, or they're kind of part of the legacy of that veterans organisation called the Salonika Reunion Association. And every year they go out to Salonika and do a battlefield trip. And I saw they had one coming up last year in September. So I thought, I'll tag along with these guys. And they were going to all the spots that I wanted to go to, including to the Battle of Roche Noir, the battlefield of Roche Noir, where my great great grandfather was wounded at. So I thought, great, they're going to have it all covered, and I can finally learn and put some meat on the bone, as it were, on this subject. So that's what I did. So we went out there, and funnily enough, the first place we went to was actually Karasuli Military Cemetery, where most of the soldiers who fell and fought with Henry at that Battle of Roche Noir, this is where they were taken if they were killed in the battle or the days afterwards. And this is, like I say, Karasuli Military Cemetery. It's got around about just over 1,000 graves, and visiting this cemetery was amazing. You know, like you're kind of traveling through rural Greece to get to this, and you think, God, like, is something like that going to exist out there? And it was just incredible. And I was going around all the graves, and I had on a list of all the men who died in the 10th Hampshires, and I was just ticking it off as we were going along. And I managed to visit every single 10th Hampshire that had died. And this is just one headstone of one of the 47, I think, or 48 men that died in there. That was Captain Lowy. He was just such an incredible character. I did quite a bit of research on him before I went out there. He was actually Jewish, and he'd been with the unit for 3 years. And at the action that he died at Roche Noir, quite a few of his fellow officers got MCs. And if you read the War Battalion Diary, his name is mentioned the most out of any of the other officers, but yet he didn't get an award. And it's interesting as well that quite a lot of Jewish servicemen that were killed in the First World War, they did get a Star of David, but he didn't. So maybe his family didn't want to reveal that he was Jewish. Maybe they were worried about maybe some bite back coming from some anti-Semitism or something like that. But yeah, he's a really interesting bloke, and I'd love to told you a little bit more about him. But yeah, he was buried there, and yeah, he is great seeing his grave. And yeah, it made me angry that he didn't have an MC before I saw that. So that was what it was like visiting Karasuli. So we went there first on our first day, and then we ended up going to the battlefield of Roche Noir. Now, it's not the greatest picture, I will admit there, but basically the action that Henry fought in was at the Battle of Roche Noir, which took place at the beginning of September 1918. It was basically a diversionary attack for the Second Battle of Doiran, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. And basically, it was to keep the Bulgarians guessing where they were going to attack, and it was to basically make sure that the Bulgarians weren't going to divert more troops to Doiran, basically to keep them where they were. And they had to basically, the 10th Hampshires had to take this hill, and they were fighting along with another battalion, the 2nd Gloucesters, who were in the same brigade as them, and they had to take 2 hills. The 10th Hampshires had to take the left, the 2nd Gloucesters had to take the right. 2nd Gloucesters went easy for them. They took it very easily within half an hour, whereas the 10th Hampshires were given the more difficult assignment. They basically had to get to this rock here, and that's where a machine gun post was, and that was causing them absolute havoc, and the whole battalion got really disorganized, and Henry was wounded, from what I can gather, by the machine gun post there. So yes, that was incredible seeing. And some of the local guides actually were able to give me some shrapnel that they found, and it was just incredible, just some of the evidence. And to get to this place as well, I should say that it's so remote. If you were to turn up there and say you flew out to Thessaloniki and you got a hire car and you drove, it's probably about an hour and a half away from the city of Thessaloniki, this place. And if you were to go out there, by the end of the day, you've probably got a chance of ending up in the local Greek nick, because when they've been out on tours out there in the past, they've been tailed by the Greek police because they're just suspicious of anybody. As I'll explain a little bit more throughout the talk, in this part of the world, because of all the different countries that have had associations to a lot of this territory, it's a politically sensitive area, and if you don't kind of fit in, they always think you're up to no good. And like I say, there's been a few examples where they've been tailed by Greek police before. Luckily, we had guides on the trip that have been Greek military or Macedonian military, so we kind of were with the right people, but you don't want to go out there by yourself. You want to go there with the people that know the area and know the land, just to keep safe. So yeah, so if I'd gone out there on my own, like I say, I could have ended up in the local Greek Nick for spying or something. But so yeah, we moved on from that area, and then the next couple of days afterwards, after the first day, we were mainly focused at the Doiran battlefield, which is just over the border from Greece in North Macedonia. And going to this area, you think, why the hell did they decide to fight here? Because some of the terrain is incredible. A lot of it is very hilly. A lot of it is, as you see there, it's scrubland. But when the battles were taking place, there was no scrubland. The Bulgarians were basically stationed in these hills, and this is where all their artillery observation posts were, all their machine gun posts, and the British are attacking up here, and they just had a great sight of everything that was going on, and there was very little place for them to hide, and essentially this is where the main area of British fighting happened in the First World War. There's two major battles at Doiran. The first one of them is in the spring of 1917, in April, May, and this is where most of the British casualties are sustained, in fact, throughout the whole of the First World War, out in the Salonika campaign. And there's one battalion, I think it's the 7th Oxford and Bucks. They went in with, I think it was just over 500 men, and they had 460 casualties. So they only came out with I think it was just roughly about 60 men unscathed. So that was terrible. And in fact, actually, their major wanted to build a memorial out there to them, but he couldn't because there wasn't enough funds to do that. So that was really unfortunate. But it was just a scene of terrible carnage. So that was kind of what happened in the first Battle of Doiran, and then the same blokes that had been annihilated in the first Battle of Doiran had to go and do it again in September 1918, where they've already known what hell it was the first year. But the reason they've been told there is by the French, because basically it's just keeping the Bulgarians pinned down. And basically, whilst their actions have been going on, there have been other actions going on in other areas of the front. The Serbians were breaking through with the French, and in fact, basically that's why they're told to go there again in September 19, because the Vardar offensive, which is going off in the west of the region, that's where all the effort's really going with the French and the Serbs. So again, the British are just told to attack this area really as a distraction. But as you see, some of the terrain there, you think, why the hell would they want to fight there? But this is kind of what the battlefields look like today. If you were to walk around here, you would find bullets, you would find pieces of shrapnel. We found barbed wire, we found shells. In fact, in a couple of these areas, some of our local guys have actually said that they've seen British bodies still on the battlefield, because they could tell, but don't know if they've been truthful or not, but they had the helmets, like the helmets were introduced in the latter part of the war, British helmets with the steel helmets, and they said that they saw, when they were doing their recce's, they saw some of these helmets, and they saw some of the bones and that of the British soldiers. And then when they were going back there the next few days later, the hats were gone, and they reckon that people were just going in there and nicking it and taking it down the scrap dealers or something. But I don't know if they're telling the truth with that one personally, but I just thought that was interesting. But this is kind of what the area looks now. You see bunkers, some more pictures, and this is the view from the top of the Devil's Eye, which was the main Bulgarian observation post, and you can really look down on the British line. So basically, to gain an understanding of it, the British were basically, I don't know if you can see my cursor, like here, and basically they're taking all this land here, but lots of the land here is just like what it looks like little hills, but it's not. It's just like lots of hills and valleys, and the Bulgarians just have a perfect view of trying to look down on this area. And this, like I say, this area here was called the Devil's Eye, and it was Bulgaria's main observation post. And Lord Milne, who was the commander in chief, he really wanted to knock this out of action, because, like I say, it was just being thorn in their side. And just to give you an idea on how low down the Salonika campaign was to the War Office, how much of low priority it was, he wrote in 1917, I think it was, for a few 8-inch howitzers, because they were the only artillery that could knock out this bunker, and it took him a year just to get one. Um, and all their artillery was being moved out all the time to places like Palestine and other fronts, or being sent to the Western Front. They would just literally write down the pecking order and get no ammunition or real supplies whatsoever. So they had to make do with what they had. But again, this area was just a nightmare to attack. After the war, the Royal Engineers get in this area, and they actually did blow up the Devil's the Devil's Eye, sorry. That so they did get there in the end. But when you're walking up to the Devil's Eye, there are a few memorials along the way that remind you of the war out there. And this is that. It's funny actually, because these two memorials, they're not quite side by side, but they're kind of roughly in the same area. And this one is actually a Bulgarian memorial called the Ferdinand Bush memorial, and it's actually, as you can see, a guy's getting his bottle of water, filling up his bottle of water there, because it's basically now a water spring. So yeah, it was quite good filling up your water there. But if you walk up the Devil's Eye, up to that observation, it takes a couple of hours to climb it. So it does take quite a lot of hard work walking up it. So you need plenty of water, and yeah, that was really relief. But like I say, this area was full of memorials, and this other memorial is actually a British memorial dedicated to the 22nd Division. And what happened was, you might be able to see that below that is where the old memorial was. But that was destroyed by the locals, apparently, because they thought gold was behind it, and they thought British soldiers carried gold with them everywhere they went. So they destroyed that after the war. And it was only about 20 years ago when they were Alan Wakefield from the Imperial War Museum and the British ambassador were trying to locate this memorial, that they stumbled across it, and they decided that the British ambassadors decided, oh, we've got some funds to do some good work in Macedonia. Let's build a memorial with those funds. So that's what they did. And I think it might have been 2008 that was inaugurated. Might got the date wrong there, but that's when they rebuilt that memorial and installed that new plaque. And they had 100 or so British Army personnel march up 2 hours to get to this place. And I should say, to get to this place, you can't easily drive up there in a Land Rover. Like the roads in the pass that are really narrow and really steep and uneven. I just can't imagine how 100 British Army personnel got up there to see the unveiling of this memorial. It was quite something, and we were carrying packs up there in 30-degree heat. So God knows what it would have been like as a soldier to get up there. But that was like the two main memorials that are located on the Doran battlefield. And again, this is more evidence, again, more concrete bunkers. It was around here that our guide was telling us that they saw those British soldiers. This is actually on Petit Coron, which is one of the smaller hills, but there was a lot of British involvement in the First Battle of Doiran. And like I say, there's plenty of missing soldiers, I reckon, buried around here. And again, we found barbed wire bullets, shrapnel, you name it, it was all there. And after we'd done our tours on the battlefields, we actually went to the Doiran Memorial, and this is actually the main memorial to those that were missing in the British Salonika force, not just from the missing at Doiran, but all the other actions that the British Salonika force were involved with. I think there's roughly it's roughly just over 8,000 names on total in the Doiran Memorial. But it's basically, this is the main part, and then it's split into like 4 cubes. There you go. You see a better picture there on the right, and there's actually 2 lions on the memorial. One's looking towards the Bulgarians, as where they would have been looking like fierce and strong, where the other one is looking back to the port and is looking sad for all the loss that's been sustained there through the Salonika campaign. And this is actually just back in mainland Greece. You have to go over the border to see the cemetery, but like I say, it's all very close together, and you get a good view as well over Lake Doran. And on a clear day as well, you can see the Devil's Eye. And at the bottom of this memorial is actually the Doiran Military Cemetery. This is again another fairly big cemetery for Salonika, for the Salonika campaign. There's roughly just over 1,000 graves here. A lot of these, though, are unidentified graves from those battles at Doiran. There's a lot of unknown soldiers in here, and I'll actually come back to that at the end in this one. So yeah, this was the Doiran Military Cemetery. On that same day, we had a bit of an unexpected a visit. We ended up going to a place called Mavroplagia. Again, I probably butchered the pronunciation there. Where we went to this local Greek village, and the reason we went there is because after the First World War and into the 1950s, some of those veterans that had joined, as I said earlier, the Salonika Reunion Association, felt like they still had ties and links to the area, and they really cared still about some of the people that lived there. I'm not an expert on 20th century Greek history, but Greece has had a lot of wars. They've had civil wars. They were under German occupation in the Second World War. And after the Second World War, there was another civil war. And some of the veterans that were still alive in the 1950s, they really cared deeply about the locals that were living in this particular village because they had suffered a lot as a result of the Civil War. So some of the veterans would go out around Britain and trying to get donations in for toys, food, clothing, all that kind of stuff. And then some of them went out there and they shipped it and they brought them all with them to Greece. And I mean, getting to there now isn't too bad because you can fly out there and then you can get a coach out there or whatever. But back in the 1950s, they would have had to do about 2 or 3 week boat trip from somewhere like Southampton to get out there. And then once they've landed, there was lots of military checkpoints. It's not like what it is now. And I just can't imagine like 60, 70-year-old blokes trying to get through going, oh yeah, we've got all this stuff for these people in a village in Greece. I can't imagine what that would have been like getting all that through. But we were able to have some conversations with some of these people, and some of these people in the village still remember those veterans actually donating some of those items, and the society's actually I didn't go on a trip this year, unfortunately, but I believe there's now a plaque about the link between the village and the association. But this village in the First World War was actually like a logistics hub for the British, and a lot of them would come there, spend a little bit of time there, just recharging their batteries, but also as well restocking their supplies. It was an important place for the British, and before the British had been there, it was actually the village had been used by the French, and the locals we met said, "Oh, you need to come and see this fountain. We believe it's a British fountain that the Royal Engineers built, but I don't know if you can see that very clearly, but it was actually built by the French." And to get to that, it was basically in an area of woodland that was just covered in leaves, and we had to get down a really steep hill. And the people that were showing us around, they're no spring chickens. I would say they're definitely in the final innings of their life. And I don't know how they got down there, because we were like all in our hiking boots. And honestly, like if one person slipped, they could have easily fallen like 50 foot and broken their neck and died. Like I can't believe that they were getting us down there, but we did get down there, and yeah, they were trying to uncover the leaves, and that they really want the Greek government to restore this, but unfortunately their pills have fallen on deaf ears. And we actually went back to one of their houses after, and we were actually drinking the local rakia. It's not a very nice drink, but you have to drink it because they think it's an insult. In that part of the world, hospitality is a really big thing. So yeah, so we did that, and I think they actually wanted us to stay for the night and have a party, but we had to move on from that village, and it was actually great meeting them. And they couldn't believe as well that people were going out there like 100 years later to pay tribute to relatives that fought out there. So yeah, that was really incredible. So after we kind of visited there, we went to the Struma Valley, and this is the other area really that the British were involved with. This is towards the east of the line, if you can remember from what I was showing you earlier. And the landscape, like I say, is chalk and cheese to Doran. This part of the land is really flat, It's kind of what we think of maybe when we think of the rice fields in Southeast Asia, very flat. You can see for miles, and a lot of this area as well had actually been before the First World War, villages that were no longer inhabited. They'd all moved out after the Balkan Wars, and you can see here, like some of these buildings. This is uh, some British soldiers doing a raid, and there was just lots of abandoned farm buildings and village buildings that really just made it perfect fighting ground. And Alan Wakefield, our guide, says that he's actually taken British troops out there on battlefield tours, and it's quite similar to the terrain that they've been fighting, that some soldiers have been fighting in Afghanistan in the last 20 years. So it was quite interesting to see the comparisons there. But this kind of area, really, there wasn't that much fighting. A lot of the fighting that did happen here were raids, skirmishes, and there was actually a few cyclist corps as well. And basically, some of the cyclist soldiers said basically they were just doing like a mini kind of Tour de France out there, to be honest, and they were just chasing Bulgarians around and going circles on their bikes. But the fighting, when it was happening out here, and I should also say as well, in Doiran, was only really taking place in April, May, and in September and October, because the temperatures were just too hot in the summer for them to fight. They basically had a truce to like not fight in the summer because the conditions were just so hot. And the biggest problem for the troops, especially in the Struma Valley, was malaria. For every 20 for every battlefield casualty sustained by the British Salonika force, there was 20 casualties down to malaria. It was just such a big problem for the British Salonika force. They did try to get around it by getting the right clothing, but it still wasn't great. Some of them were taking quinine as well, which is a drug to help them deal with it, but it was still a major problem. And a lot of the battalions as well were going down to normally at least half their full strength because of malaria. Battalions roughly seen as 800 men, but some of these battalions that were out, especially in the Struma Valley, because it was just the perfect conditions for mosquitoes to grow, to just thrive off the land there. A lot of these battalions were 400 men, if that. In some cases, they've got them even lower. In fact, there was actually a composite battalion actually formed out there, where basically you had like kind of three men, like groups of men from three different battalions to form one battalion. And I know that some of the men from Henry's battalion, the 10th Hampshires, actually formed that composite battalion. And I wouldn't be surprised if Henry was part of that, because he actually didn't get malaria in the First World War, from what we know from the medical records that do survive. So whilst we were in this part of the world, again, we visited some more cemeteries. The main one out in this area is the Struma Military Cemetery. There's around about 1,000 graves in the Struma Military Cemetery, and then there's this other one here, which is the Lahana Cemetery, quite a small one. So again, we were visiting cemeteries. The other area you kind of need to, or it's quite interesting to know about, is an area that the British Salonika force called the Cushy Balkan Hills. This is kind of the area we went to after we went to the Struma, where it kind of is like the divide between the areas of Doiran and the Struma Valley. And the Cushy Balkan Hills got the name the Cushy Balkan Hills is because not much action was seen there, and it was seen as having a cushy time there, as it makes sense. I think it's actually called the Krushny Hills, but again, the British wanted to make it easier for them to know. But a lot of the soldiers that were actually stationed in this area were reserve and garrison battalions. There's actually quite a lot of reports, and quite a few soldiers that served in this area were actually in their 60s, and it was a bit like something out of Dad's army. And the training, and some of the soldiers that were training these older soldiers were complaining about their ailments with trying to throw mill bombs because they had arthritis, or they had arthritis in their fingers while trying to like reload a machine gun or something, trying to do basic like weapons training with them. So they were actually known as I think it was the 228 Brigade, or known as the 22 Late Brigade, because they were really old and really slow at marching or stuff like that. I think that's what they were called. But they did come in. One thing that they were good for, though, is because a lot of these soldiers were old career soldiers. They'd been to some of the far-flung places in the British Empire, like India, which means that they didn't go down with malaria. So they were actually quite useful. So they were just basically there doing a job. The reason this area was an easy time is because the land, both sides acknowledged that it didn't really have any value in fighting over, but it was an area that needed to be guarded of the line. So, like I say, the soldiers were just there just for like guard duty. Really, they weren't really doing anything. So then we went, after we visited that area, we actually went to another cemetery called Saragol Military Cemetery, and this is quite an interesting cemetery. There's again about 800 to 1,000 graves in this one, and this is actually a grave of Lieutenant Colonel Robinson. He was actually killed at the first Battle of Doran, or he died from his wounds at the first Battle of Doran. He actually got a nasty bit of shrapnel in the back of his neck. And he was actually, even though it does say East Surrey Regiment on that, he was actually leading the 7th Oxford and Bucks. He was actually their temporary colonel that day, and he was the commanding officer, as I said, that they got killed and wiped out pretty much the battalion there. And yeah, he was their commanding officer. Like I say, he did make it back to casualty clearance station, but he died shortly afterwards. And then after we visited Saragol for the last couple of days, we headed back to Thessaloniki, and there's two major cemeteries in Thessaloniki in a minute. I'll go into the main one in a minute, but the other one they have out there is the Micro British Cemetery, and this is actually the biggest cemetery out of anywhere in the Salonika campaign, and there's roughly, I think, just over 2,000 bearers there. And this chap here is the grave of Lieutenant Colonel Beckett. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Beckett, you think, why do I want to talk about him? Well, he was actually the commanding officer of my great-great-grandfather Henry's battalion. He had such an interesting life. He was a career soldier, and I reckon if he'd survived the First World War, he could have been a Montgomery or one of the leading generals of the Second World War, because out in Salonika, he was one of the most decorated soldiers they had. He was given, I think it was the Grand Order of Serbia, which is one of the highest awards they have in their gallantry. He was awarded the DSO, and he was, like I say, he was made Lieutenant Colonel of that composite battalion. He was literally at the front and center of anything they were doing in the Streamer Valley attack-wise, and he actually had quite an interesting personal life as well, because he actually married a woman just before he was posted to Salonika, called Winifred Paynton, and it turns out after the war she became a lesbian, and she was living with a group of artists called the Lamurna Society, which the likes of Sir Alfred Munnings and Dame Laura Knight had connections to, and she lived there for the rest of her life. And I've actually been in contact with the Lamurna Society, and they didn't know anything about that she was married to this chap Beckett. So yeah, I'm trying to do a little bit more research into her life and his life as well. And I've actually been in touch with his great niece, and she didn't know anything about him. And the funny thing is, he's buried in Greece, and she's had a holiday home in Greece for the last 30 years. And I just thought, wow, what a coincidence that no one in her family knew anything about Beckett, but yet she's still got kind of a weird coincidence to him. But yeah, he died in an accident, a training accident. He was killed by he was standing too close to a grenade that went off when inspecting a bomb party, and he died shortly afterwards after getting wounded. And I tried to find out a bit more about his death, because I was like, please don't be my great-great-grandfather that was responsible for his death. But thankfully he wasn't. And yes, it was really sad that he died, because like I say, I think he could have been, he had the profile to be probably a general in the Second World War if he'd lived. So yeah, that was a shame. And then after we visited Micra, we went to Lambert Road Cemetery and visited Henry's grave. And this is the main, really the main cemetery, not just for the British Salonika Force, but for the whole Salonika, all the Allied forces in Salonika. There's around about 1,500 graves here. They're joined with French graves. There's around about 8,000 French graves there. There's about 5,000 Serbian graves there. There's Italian graves there. There's Russian graves there. The Allied Salonika force was a very big multinational force. They had lots of different countries represented. You even had the Japanese. The Japanese even sent a naval fleet to patrol the Mediterranean, and they were based out of Salonika. That's again one small nation that you wouldn't think of that was involved. Salonika campaign. I'm probably not giving you the best overview tonight, but it was such a multinational campaign, and you can see from this postcard here in 1916. I think you've got at least about 8 or 9 different countries there. Like I say, it was just a big allied force, and it's quite interesting. Each year there is a memorial service at a place called Policastro, which is where the Allied memorial, as it were, is, and there's representatives sent every year from each country. So the British contingent is represented by the Salonika Campaign Society. I'm normally represented by Alan Wakefield, who's the head of the First World War Department at the Imperial War Museum. You've got the French that go there, the Italians that go there, the Serbs that go there, the Russians used to go there until the war in Ukraine, but apparently they did have a representative this year, which was interesting. But he had to keep himself distanced from everybody else, and they've even had people from India that go out there before, I believe. So yeah, a big multinational contingent that isn't that it still isn't forgotten. So that was that. But this journey in Salonika really it has inspired me, and as Henry said at the top of the show, I'm actually now the secretary of the Salonika Campaign Society, and I kind of was going to draw a line after that trip, and I wasn't going to really get involved in it too much. But unfortunately, I've got a passion now for all things Salonika. And whilst we were out there, I took a picture of this grave of an unknown British officer who's actually based in the Doyer Military Cemetery. And I've kind of got a mission now to kind of promote the Salonika campaign, and that's why I'm talking to you guys tonight. And you often hear of, like, every now and again soldiers being identified on the Western Front. They find a body in one location, and then after hard work goes into it, that sometimes they're able to identify some of these graves. And I thought, well, is there possibly one that I could try and find the identity of in Salonika? And I took this picture of Alan whilst I was out there, and as you can see on his grave, it says that he died on the 24th to the 25th of April 1917. And I was like, well, okay, like, we've still got dozens of officers that were killed, I said, but if we could look into a little bit more, it wouldn't be possible to try and identify who this officer is. And he was like, no, it's not. So kind of got back and I put it to one side and didn't really think of it too much. But then again, I heard about a recent soldier identified on the Western Front, and I thought, I'm going to really research this and see if we can get anywhere with it. Unfortunately, after doing a bit of digging, I now have narrowed it down to 4 potential candidates, because I managed to find in the deep archives of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission that this grave belonged to an officer of the 12th Battalion Hampshire Regiment, and we know that there are only 4 officers missing now. Now we've got to try and sift through them and try and find if we can do that. We've got a 1 in 4 chance, but I don't think that's terrible odds. So I've already started doing a little bit of digging. Luckily, some of their officer record files survive, and one of the candidates is this chap, Captain Graham Montgomery, and he's quite an interesting bloke, actually. He was actually the earl, or the son to become an earl, son of an earl, sorry, and he could have inherited a baronetcy, and his basically the title died out after his dad died, but his dad was desperate to try and find him, and in his actual file at the National Archives in Kew, he's actually got a picture of his son that he sent in saying, if you see my son, can you try and find him? And this is what he looks like. And in his file, there's lots of letters saying that he's had rumors that he was a prisoner of war and he's in Bulgaria. And he's even writing like 10, 15 years after the war saying, is there any news? So that's just something I've been able to find by just looking at his file. And then I went to the Hampshire Regiment archive and I was able to find this picture of him having a bath. So just by this coincidence that we know that it's a man of the 12 Hampshires, I've just been able to identify on a few more of their stories. But if we can find out that, if we can identify that man in that grave is the captain, then it has to be this man, because he is the only captain that went missing from the 12 Hampshires. So if we can prove it's him, then maybe if we can prove it's the captain, then we can prove that it's this man. But then if we can eliminate him, then we're down to 3 because the rest were second lieutenants. So it's still clutching at straws maybe a little bit, but I've got donkey's years hopefully to try and find out. So so he's just something I've done a side note on, and that's where my podcast comes in. I've actually recorded a couple of episodes of my podcast and my research on that mission. So if you want to go and listen to it, you can do, which is at Salonika Secrets. So yeah, that's my talk of the secrets of Salonika tonight. It's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I've probably not gone to maybe as detailed as I could have on a few things, and I might have lost you at 1 or 2 points, but this is your time if you've got any questions you want to ask about the Salonika campaign, and I'll do my best to answer.
Well, that was absolutely brilliant, Chris. Thank you so much. You covered a huge amount of ground, and it was absolutely fascinating. I think we've had some great comments coming through on the chat. I think people really, really enjoyed that. Interesting. I think there are some people who've been to Salonika, have done some of the tours, who know Alan Wakefield as well, and then others like me who kind of knew next to nothing about this topic at all. So I think it was a fantastic introduction, and I imagine has probably piqued a lot of interest in people who didn't know much about it before. So there's a really interesting question from Darren, who I know's got a family connection here. I don't know, Darren, do you want to ask it, or do you want me to read out? So the question is, he believes his great-grandfather and siblings were out there with the 8th Battalion South Wales Borderers. Is that a unit that you've looked into? Do you know much about what actions?
I know that there were South Wales Borders out in Salonika. I know there was some out in Doiran. I can't remember what battalion he is off the top of my head, but I think the second VC that was awarded out in Salonika, only 2 VCs were awarded. I think one was from the south, or from the border regiment, and he's actually quite an interesting bloke. This guy called Lieutenant Colonel Dan Burgess, and he was actually taken prisoner of war at the second Battle of Doiran, but because the Bulgarians were on the retreat, they just ended up abandoning him in the end. And the surgeon that operated on his legs did the operation of my great-great-grandfather 2 weeks later. So, and after the war, he would go on to be the chief beefeater at the Tower of London. So, so yeah, he had quite an interesting story.
Wow.
So yeah, so as far as I know, the borders, there were borders out there, but that's something that if you want to drop me a line, I can try and do a bit more digging for you if you like, because I am the secretary now of the Salonika Campaign Society and I get all the inquiries. So come to me with that, and I can I can try and look into that a little bit more.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's great. Well, I could see, Darren's going to take you up on that offer, so thank you. Claire, you've got a question.
Hi, thanks. Very excellent talk. Thank you very much. I was just interested to hear if you could expand a bit on the cyclists in the Struma, because I'm not sure if I understood you properly, but it sounded as if you said that they cycled around in circles.
Yeah, it's quite funny. Unfortunately, I'm not the best person to explain. I could actually pass you on to a good chap actually. The Campaign Society actually had a really good day in August at the Great War Huts, and one of the talks was on the cyclists, because a guy called Robin, his grandfather was in the cyclist corps, and he went into all detail about it. But yeah, there were a couple of cyclist battalions out in at Salonika, but one of the only places they really could have been effective in is the Struma, because it's so flat and you can see for miles. And yeah, some of I think 1 or 2 of the accounts that I've heard before, they said basically they were just chasing the Bulgarians in circles by going around on their bikes. But yeah, it's an area that I'm not the best person to explain on the cyclists, but there were, like I say, there were cyclist battalions out there.
My grandfather was, my maternal grandfather was a cyclist in the Struma Valley, and I correspond with Robin. He is the expert, isn't he? And the only problem with that study day is that if you live in Australia, it's fairly hard to get to.
Yeah,
which is why
doing.
I begged them to record it, but they apparently didn't. But Robin sent me his thoughts, so that's good. Thank you.
Great.
That's right.
Thanks for the question, Claire, and interesting to hear your family connection. So just see there's been a little bit of correspondence in the chat. So John B, thanks for that. So I think, John, you've got a family connection as well, haven't you, with your great uncle? And he's just confirmed, yeah, 7th and 8th South Wales borderers were out there. So that's good to have that. We've had a couple of mentions in the chat as well. I think Mary posted that another interesting thing about Salonika is it's the birthplace of Kemal Ataturk. And Byron's put a link. He's obviously had a visit there fairly recently, and there's a museum, and yeah, of course, there's Gallipoli connections through that as well. So it sounds like there's a lot to look at when you're there. I had a question actually. When you were quite early on in the talk, you showed a really interesting picture of the Serbian army in retreat in the winter. I don't know if you think of that picture.
Yeah. I did. Sorry, I didn't quite go off. I could have easily gone down on the tangent.
No, don't. I was just curious because it looked like they're kind of carrying a really big object with them.
Yeah, I think I can't remember
what that is.
I can't, without going back into it. But yeah, going on to Serbia, like I said, there's a chap called Nick Ilic, and he's actually the defense attaché to Serbia. And he's done a couple of talks I've seen this year. One was at the Great War Hut group, and he did another one at our AGM, and some of the stuff that he's been doing out there and some of the talks that you get, they're incredible stories. Like, you should get him try and come and do one. He actually told the story of it's an admiral called Trudeau. I can't remember his name, but he was literally in charge of the British did send like a few Royal Marine Artillery, I think it was, out to Serbia, and in their retreat, he basically like oversaw it, and he was responsible for the evacuation. But he's like had a lot of honours given to him out in Serbia, and and even the Scottish Women's Hospital. I didn't even touch upon that. They had a really big presence out in Serbia. In fact, actually, there's a good book out called Vera and Jack. I can't remember who the author is now, but she came and did a talk about they were both suffragettes before the war, and then when the war came along, they both enlisted in the Scottish Women's Hospital, were based out in Serbia, and one of them has a hospital named after them out there today, and there's a few other Scottish women that were based out there. That's an incredible story. That again, I'm not really an expert on that, but yeah, that's something. If people want to go and have a look at that, then I'd urge you to try and look into that, a bit more of that, the Serbian retreat, and especially if you can find angles on the British, because that story is really interesting. Yeah,
that's great. And there was the story, I can't remember the woman's name, but who served with distinction with the Serbian forces, didn't she?
Flora Sands.
That's it, Flora Sands. Yeah, decorated and so on. So brilliant. Thank you. Actually, a couple of kind people have answered my question, so thanks, Jonas, for that. So the box that I saw, that's apparently the Serbian commander-in-chief being carried in a sedan chair. Putnik. Thanks, Mark. So there's a bit of detail there, yeah. That makes sense. We've got a question from John. So he says his grandfather was in the Army Service Corps. We have some photos of his truck in a hilly area, which we put these on the Salonika Society website. Do you know where this might be?
I'm not 100% sure. The person that would know would be our web officer, Andy. So if you want to give me an email or something, I'll put my email in the group chat, actually, if you want to send me a line, and then I can nudge him to find out what's going on.
Great. Oh, thanks for that.
So I'll share my email on that.
Okay. Fabulous. Great. Well, I think that's gone through all the questions. I don't think there's anything more outstanding. So we'll draw to a close, but we'll thank you once again, Chris, for absolutely brilliant talk. A great thing is it's been recorded, so if you enjoyed it, you can enjoy it again and watch. And we'll certainly make it available. We'll put it on the Great Wall Group YouTube channel as soon as we can. And thanks for sharing your insights with us. I think the fact that you had that personal connection, that you're able to investigate, and great that you've found another rabbit hole to go down with researching your unknown British officer. This looks like endless years of
torture.
Fascinating work to do. But yeah, really appreciate it, Chris. Thanks ever so much.